The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as Prince William walked slowly through the Queen's private garden. His footsteps were heavy on the gravel path, each step seeming to echo the weight he carried in his heart. It had been 3 months since his grandmother's passing, and the world still felt different somehow. The colors seemed less bright. The laughter at family gatherings felt forced, and the silence in the places where her voice once filled the air was deafening. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, watched her husband from the kitchen window of their cottage on the estate. She had been married to William for over a decade now, and she knew every expression that crossed his face, every way his shoulders moved when he was struggling with something he couldn't quite put into words. This morning was no different. She could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands were clasped behind his back in that particular way that meant he was lost in thought. The past few months had been a whirlwind of state functions, memorial services, and public appearances. William had thrown himself into his royal duties with the dedication that had been instilled in him since childhood. But Catherine could see the toll it was taking. He smiled for the cameras, shook hands with dignitaries, and delivered speeches with the same grace he always had, but she knew him well enough to see the exhaustion behind his eyes. Their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, had been asking questions that were difficult to answer. How do you explain to a child that their great-grandmother, who had been a constant presence in their lives, was never coming back? How do you help them understand the weight of duty and tradition when they were still learning to tie their shoes and ride bicycles? Catherine had always been the steady presence in their family, the one who could calm William's storms and bring lightness to heavy moments. But even she was struggling to find the right words lately. The Queen's death had affected her more deeply than she had expected. Elizabeth II had been more than just her husband's grandmother. She had become a mentor, a source of wisdom, and in many ways, a second mother. The phone rang, interrupting Catherine's thoughts. It was William's private secretary, informing her that there had been a change in the schedule. The charity event they were supposed to attend that afternoon had been moved to a different venue, and there were new security concerns that needed to be addressed. Catherine listened politely, took notes, and assured the secretary that she would inform William. But as she hung up the phone, she felt a sudden wave of exhaustion wash over her. It wasn't just the constant schedule changes or the security briefings or the endless list of obligations. It was the feeling that they were living their lives in a fishbowl, that every moment was scheduled and scrutinized, that there was no space left for simply being human. She walked outside to find William still standing in the garden, now staring at a rose bush that had been the Queen's favorite. The roses were in full bloom, their deep red petals catching the morning light. Catherine approached slowly, not wanting to disturb his thoughts, but needing to be near him. The secretary called, she said quietly, standing beside him. They've moved the venue for this afternoon. William nodded, but didn't look away from the roses. She planted these herself, you know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. When I was young, maybe 7 or 8, she brought me out here one Saturday morning and showed me how to plant bulbs. She said that gardening taught you patience, that you had to trust that something beautiful would grow even when you couldn't see any progress. Catherine reached out and took his hand. His fingers were cold despite the warm morning air. She was right, Catherine said. Look how beautiful they are now. I keep expecting her to walk around the corner, William continued. Every time I'm here, every time I walk through these gardens or sit in that drawing room where we used to have tea, I keep thinking I'll hear her voice calling for the corgis or asking someone to bring her reading glasses. Catherine squeezed his hand gently. She understood. The Queen's presence had been so constant, so reliable, that her absence felt almost impossible to accept. Elizabeth II had been the anchor of the royal family for over 70 years, and now they were all learning to navigate without that steady guidance. The children asked me again yesterday when we're going to see Gone, Catherine said, using the pet name the children had for their great-grandmother. Louis drew her a picture of a horse. He wanted to know if we could mail it to heaven. William's composure finally cracked, and Catherine saw tears forming in his eyes. What did you tell him? I told him that Gone would love the picture, and That we could keep it in a special place where we remember all the wonderful things about her, Catherine replied. But honestly, William, I'm struggling too. I don't know how to help them process this when I'm barely managing to process it myself. They stood in silence for a long moment, surrounded by the Queen's roses and the weight of their shared grief. Catherine thought about all the times they had stood in this very spot for family photos, the children running around their legs while the Queen smiled and gave gentle directions to the photographer. Those moments had seemed so ordinary at the time, but now they felt precious beyond measure. I had a dream about her last night, William said suddenly. We were sitting in her study at Buckingham Palace, and she was showing me some old photographs from when my father was young. She was laughing about something he had done, some mischief he had gotten into, and then she looked at me and said, "The best way to honor those who came before us is to live fully in the present." That sounds like something she would say, Catherine agreed. She always had a way of cutting through the complicated parts and getting to the heart of things. William turned to look at his wife, really look at her for the first time that morning. He saw the exhaustion she was trying to hide, the way she was holding her shoulders just a little too straight, the careful way she was choosing her words. Catherine had always been his rock, his source of strength, but he realized he had been so caught up in his own grief that he hadn't been paying attention to hers. "How are you really doing?" he asked, and the question caught Catherine off guard. She had been so focused on taking care of everyone else, the children, William, the royal household staff who had also loved the Queen, that she hadn't stopped to consider her own emotional state. "I don't know," she admitted, and the honesty of her answer surprised them both. "I feel like I'm living in a strange dream sometimes. We go through the motions of our daily lives, but everything feels different. The palace feels different, family dinners feel different, even the way people look at us feels different." William nodded. He had felt it too, the subtle shift in how people related to them now that he was one step closer to the throne, now that the future of the monarchy rested more heavily on their shoulders. People had always been respectful, but now there was something else in their eyes, a kind of reverence mixed with expectation that felt overwhelming. "Sometimes I miss being just us," Catherine continued. "Before all this, when we were just William and Catherine, just a family trying to figure things out like everyone else. Now it feels like we're carrying the weight of history on our shoulders, and I'm terrified of making a mistake." "You won't make a mistake," William said firmly. "You never do. You have better instincts than anyone I know." Catherine smiled sadly. "I appreciate your confidence, but I'm just making it up as I go along, same as everyone else. The difference is that when I make a mistake, it ends up on the front page of newspapers around the world." They heard the sound of children's laughter coming from the direction of their cottage, and they both turned to see George, Charlotte, and Louis running across the lawn with their nanny close behind. The children were playing some elaborate game that involved a great deal of dramatic falling down, and even more dramatic getting back up. "Look at them," Catherine said softly. "They're so resilient. They've accepted this change in a way that I'm not sure I have yet." "Children are better at living in the present than adults are," William observed. "They don't carry the weight of the past or worry about the future the way we do." As they watched their children play, Catherine felt a shift in her perspective. Maybe that was what the Queen would have wanted for them. Not to be paralyzed by the magnitude of their responsibilities, but to find ways to live fully within them. To raise their children with love and laughter, to find moments of joy even in the midst of duty and obligation. "I've been thinking about something," Catherine said suddenly. "What if we took the children away for a few days? Somewhere quiet, where we could just be a family without any official engagements or photographers or protocol to worry about." William considered this. The idea was appealing, but their schedules were booked solid for the next several months. There were state visits to prepare for, charity events to attend, and the constant stream of meetings and briefings that came with their roles. "Where would we go?" he asked. "Anywhere we take the children, there will be security concerns and media attention." "What about Balmoral?" Catherine suggested. "It's private, it's secure, and the children love it there. We could spend a few days hiking, having picnics, just being together without any agenda." William's face brightened for the first time that morning. Balmoral held so many good memories. Summers spent there as a child, quiet evenings with his grandmother, long walks in the Scottish Highlands where he could think clearly. It was one of the few places where the royal family could truly relax and be themselves. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said. "But can we really just leave? Won't people expect us to be available for official duties?" "The world won't end if we take a few days to recharge," Catherine said firmly. "And honestly, I think we'll be better at our jobs if we take some time to remember who we are underneath all the titles and expectations." As if summoned by their conversation, the children came running over, their faces flushed from playing in the sun. Louis, the youngest, threw himself into Catherine's arms with the complete trust that only small children possess. "Mummy, we're playing Palace, and Charlotte is being the queen, but she's being bossy," Louis announced with the indignation of a 5-year-old who has been wronged. "I'm not being bossy," Charlotte replied with the dignity of a 7-year-old. "I'm being royal. There's a difference." George, now 9 and increasingly aware of his future role, rolled his eyes at his siblings' antics. "You're both being silly. Real queens don't boss people around. They help people and make important decisions." Catherine and William exchanged a look over their children's heads. Even in their play, the children were grappling with questions about leadership, responsibility, and what it meant to serve others. They were learning these lessons not from textbooks or formal instruction, but from watching their parents and great-grandmother navigate the complexities of royal life. "What if I told you that we might take a trip to Balmoral next week?" William said, and immediately all 3 children's faces lit up with excitement. "Can we ride ponies?" Charlotte asked. "Can we build a fort in the woods?" George wanted to know, "Can we have a picnic with sandwiches and cake?" Louis added, his priorities clearly established. "We can do all of those things," Catherine promised, and she felt her heart lift at their enthusiasm. Sometimes the best solutions are the simplest ones. Time together, away from the pressures and expectations, remembering what truly mattered. As the morning progressed, and they walked back toward their cottage together, Catherine found herself thinking about the Queen's advice that William had remembered from his dream. "The best way to honor those who came before us is to live fully in the present." Perhaps that was exactly what they needed to do, not to be paralyzed by the weight of their inheritance, but to find ways to live with purpose, joy, and authenticity within it. The palace could wait. The official engagements could be rescheduled. Right now, they were simply a family who had experienced a profound loss and needed time to heal together. And sometimes Catherine thought that was the most royal thing they could do, to remember their humanity in the midst of their duty, and to teach their children that love and family were the true foundations of any lasting legacy. The Scottish Highlands stretched endlessly before them, rolling green hills dotted with purple heather and ancient stone walls that had witnessed centuries of history. Catherine stood on the terrace of Balmoral Castle, breathing in the crisp morning air that carried the scent of pine and the distant sound of the River Dee flowing through the valley below. For the first time in months, she felt like she could truly breathe. 3 days into their family retreat, the change in all of them was remarkable. William's shoulders had lost their perpetual tension. The children were running wild and free across the estate grounds, and Catherine found herself sleeping through the night for the first time since the Queen's funeral. There were no photographers hiding in the bushes, no official cars pulling up the driveway, no private secretaries appearing with urgent messages that demanded immediate attention. William emerged from the castle carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea, a tradition they had started on their first morning there. They had discovered that the early morning hours, before the children woke up, were precious pockets of peace where they could simply exist together without any agenda or expectation. "The children are still fast asleep," he reported, settling into the chair beside her. "Yesterday's hike wore them out completely." Catherine smiled, remembering the previous day's adventure through Glen Muick. They had packed sandwiches and thermoses of hot chocolate and set off on what was supposed to be a gentle family walk. But the children's enthusiasm had turned it into an epic expedition. complete with treasure hunts for interesting rocks, impromptu lessons about wildlife from William, and a great deal of splashing in the stream. Lewis fell asleep in his hiking boots, Catherine said. I didn't have a heart to wake him up to take them off. George asked me if we could live here forever, William said, and there was something wistful in his voice. Just pack up and become Scottish farmers or something. What did you tell him? I told him that wouldn't be very fair to all the people who were counting on us back in London, William replied. But honestly, part of me understands the appeal. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the mist rise from the valley floor as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Catherine thought about how different this felt from their usual mornings, which typically began with briefings about the day's schedule, reviews of speech drafts, or consultations with wardrobe teams about what would be appropriate for each event. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, Catherine said eventually, about feeling like we're losing ourselves in our roles. The previous evening, after the children had gone to bed, they had stayed up late talking by the fireplace in the Queen's favorite sitting room. William had confessed that sometimes he felt like he was becoming a stranger to himself, that the person he was in private was so different from the person he presented to the world that he worried he might forget who he really was. I used to think that being royal meant having all the answers, William continued. When I was young, I watched my grandmother handle every crisis with such calm certainty. I thought that when my time came, I would naturally develop that same confidence, that same sure sense of what was right. And now I realize that she probably felt just as uncertain as I do sometimes, but she had learned how to carry that uncertainty with grace, William said. She made it look effortless, but I'm beginning to understand that it took enormous strength. Catherine nodded. She had observed the Queen closely during her years in the royal family, and she had noticed the small moments when Elizabeth's mask slipped slightly, a brief hesitation before a difficult decision, a tight smile when dealing with a particularly challenging situation, the way she would sometimes pause and take a deep breath before walking into a room full of people expecting her to solve their problems. Do you think she was happy? Catherine asked suddenly. It was a question that had been nagging at her for weeks, but she hadn't known how to voice it. William considered this carefully. I think she found purpose in her duty, and I think that gave her a kind of satisfaction that most people never experience. But happiness? That's harder to say. She rarely talked about her own feelings or desires. That's what scares me sometimes, Catherine admitted. The idea that duty might gradually consume everything else until there's nothing left of who we really are. Before William could respond, they heard the sound of footsteps on the stone terrace, and Charlotte appeared in her pajamas, her hair sticking up at odd angles, and her face still creased from sleep. "Mummy, Daddy, can we have pancakes for breakfast?" she asked, climbing into Catherine's lap without ceremony. "We can absolutely have pancakes," Catherine replied, smoothing down her daughter's unruly hair. "But first, how about we wake up your brothers and get everyone dressed?" As they went through the familiar morning routine of getting 3 children fed, dressed, and organized for the day, Catherine found herself paying attention to the small moments that usually passed by unnoticed. The way Lewis insisted on wearing his socks inside out, because they felt better that way. George's careful attention to making sure his bed was perfectly neat before leaving his room. Charlotte's habit of humming under her breath while she brushed her teeth. These are the details that wouldn't make it into any official biography or historical record, but they were the things that made her children real, unique individuals rather than just future members of the royal family. She realized that one of her most important jobs was protecting these authentic pieces of who they were, making sure they didn't get lost in the weight of expectations and protocol. After breakfast, they decided to visit the old stone bridge that crossed a narrow part of the River Dee. It was one of William's favorite spots from his childhood, a place where he and Prince Harry had spent countless summer afternoons building dams and racing stick boats downstream. The walk to the bridge took them through a grove of ancient oak trees, their massive trunks scarred with decades of carved initials from visitors who had wanted to leave some mark of their presence. George was fascinated by these glimpses into the past, trying to decipher names and dates that had been carved by long-dead hands. "Look, Papa," he said, pointing to a heart carved deep into the bark with the initials, JR plus MS 1952 inside. Do you think they're still together? I hope so, William replied. That was a very long time ago, so they would be quite old now if they're still alive. Will our children carve their initials here someday? Charlotte asked, and the question struck Catherine as unexpectedly profound. Would there be continuity between this moment and some future summer when their grandchildren might play in these same woods? Or would the world change in ways they couldn't imagine, making traditions like this seem quaint and obsolete? Maybe they will, Catherine said. Or maybe they'll find their own special places to make memories. When they reached the bridge, Louis immediately wanted to throw sticks into the water and watch them float away. It was such a simple pleasure, but Catherine found herself deeply moved by his pure joy in something so uncomplicated. There were no cameras recording this moment, no historians taking notes about its significance, no one analyzing the symbolic meaning of the future king's youngest child playing in a Scottish stream. William sat on the stone wall of the bridge and pulled out his phone, not to check emails or respond to messages, but to take pictures of the children playing. Catherine noticed that he was being careful to capture the candid moments. Louis's look of intense concentration as he selected the perfect stick, Charlotte's delighted laughter when her stick shot through the rapids faster than anyone else's, George's protective instincts as he helped his little brother choose stones to throw. These are the pictures I want to remember, William said quietly to Catherine. Not the official portraits or the state dinner photos, but these moments when they're just being themselves. As the morning progressed, they found themselves talking more openly than they had in months. Without the constant pressure of schedules and obligations, they could actually listen to each other, process their thoughts and feelings without being interrupted by the next urgent matter demanding their attention. Catherine shared her worries about raising the children in the public eye, about how to give them normal experiences when their lives were anything but normal. William talked about the loneliness he sometimes felt in his role, the way that being constantly surrounded by people could still leave him feeling isolated and misunderstood. Sometimes I wonder what our lives would have been like if we had met under different circumstances, Catherine said as they watched the children explore a fallen log that had created a natural bridge across a shallow part of the stream. Do you ever regret it? William asked, and she could hear the vulnerability in his question. The whole thing? The public scrutiny, the loss of privacy, the pressure. Catherine thought about this seriously. It wasn't a question she could answer lightly, because there had been moments, particularly in the early years of their marriage, when every outfit choice was dissected and every public appearance was analyzed for signs of marital discord, when she had wondered if she was strong enough for this life. I don't regret loving you, she said finally. I don't regret our children or the family we've built together. But I do sometimes grieve for the simplicity we've lost, for the ability to make mistakes without the whole world watching. I used to think that was selfish, William admitted. Wanting privacy, wanting normal experiences for our family. I thought that accepting this role meant giving up any right to complain about the sacrifices. It's not selfish to want to protect the people you love, Catherine replied. And it's not selfish to want your children to have some space to figure out who they are without constant judgment. They were interrupted by Charlotte calling for their attention. She had discovered a family of ducks swimming near the bank of the stream, and she was convinced that the baby ducks needed rescuing because they seemed too small to be on their own. The mama duck knows how to take care of her babies, Catherine explained gently. Just like we know how to take care of you. But what if something happens to the mama duck? Charlotte persisted, her 7-year-old mind already jumping to worst-case scenarios. Then, the papa duck would step in, William said, crouching down beside his daughter. And if something happened to both of them, there are other ducks in the family who would help. That's how families work. We look out for each other. Catherine watched this exchange and realized that they were having conversations about love, protection, and responsibility without ever mentioning titles or duties or the weight of the crown. Their children were learning about service and leadership through these everyday moments, understanding that caring for others was natural and necessary rather than a burden imposed by birthright. Later that afternoon, As they made their way back to the castle for lunch, Catherine found herself walking slightly behind the others, observing her family with new eyes. William was carrying Louis on his shoulders, both of them singing a nonsense song that made no sense but clearly delighted them both. George and Charlotte were walking hand in hand, deep in conversation about whether fish could see colors. This was what mattered, Catherine realized. Not the perfect public appearances or the flawless execution of official duties, but these authentic moments of connection and joy. The Queen had understood this too, in her own way. Despite all the formal protocols and centuries of tradition, Elizabeth II had always made time for her family, had always found ways to be a grandmother and great-grandmother, even while carrying the weight of the crown. That evening, after the children were asleep, Catherine and William walked through the Queen's private gardens at Balmoral. The flowers here were different from those at Windsor, hardier varieties that could withstand the Scottish weather, arranged with less formality but equal care. She would have loved seeing the children here this week, William said, stopping beside a bench where they had often seen the Queen sitting with her dogs. She would have been pleased that we took the time, Catherine agreed. I think she understood better than anyone the importance of stepping away from the public role sometimes. As they sat on the bench, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of the Scottish evening, Catherine felt a sense of clarity that had been missing for months. The grief would always be there. The loss of the Queen's wisdom and guidance would continue to create moments of uncertainty and sadness. But they didn't have to carry that grief alone, and they didn't have to let it prevent them from finding joy and meaning in their lives. I want to make a promise, Catherine said suddenly. Whatever else happens, whatever responsibilities we take on in the future, I want us to always make time for this. For being together as a family, for remembering who we are underneath everything else. William took her hand and squeezed it gently. I promise too, he said, and I think she would approve of that promise. As they sat together in the gathering dusk, Catherine felt something shift inside her. The fear and uncertainty were still there, but they no longer felt overwhelming. Tomorrow they would return to London, to their official duties and public obligations. But they would return as a stronger family, with a clearer sense of what truly mattered and a renewed commitment to protecting the authentic core of who they were. The return to London felt like stepping back into a different world. The peaceful mornings at Balmoral, where the only sounds were birdsong and children's laughter, were replaced by the constant hum of traffic outside Kensington Palace and the immediate pressure of schedule that had grown even more demanding during their brief absence. Catherine sat at her desk in her private office, looking at the stack of briefing papers that had accumulated while they were away. Charity events, state dinners, foreign visits, and ceremonial duties stretched out before them like an endless parade of obligations. Each event was important in its own way, representing causes they cared about or diplomatic relationships that needed nurturing, but the sheer volume felt overwhelming after their week of freedom. William appeared in her doorway, his own stack of papers in hand, and an expression that mirrored her feelings exactly. They had been back for only 2 days, but already the peaceful clarity they had found in Scotland felt like it was slipping away, replaced by the familiar sensation of being pulled in dozens of different directions at once. The Foreign Office wants to discuss the trade mission to South America, William said, settling into the chair across from her desk. And my private secretary has scheduled 3 different meetings about the environmental summit next month. The children's schools want confirmation about which parent will attend the autumn concerts, Catherine replied, scanning her own notes. And there are 4 different charity galas asking us to be patron saints of their fundraising efforts. They had only been home for 48 hours, but Catherine already felt the familiar tension returning to her shoulders. It wasn't just the busy schedule. She was accustomed to that by now. It was the feeling that every moment was accounted for, every decision was scrutinized, every public appearance was analyzed for its deeper meaning or symbolic significance. Charlotte asked me this morning why we can't just live at Balmoral all the time, William said, and Catherine could hear the weariness in his voice. She said it was better there, because we had time to play games after dinner. Catherine felt a pang of guilt. Their daughter was right. At Balmoral, They had lingered over meals, told stories, and played card games by the fireplace until the children's eyes grew heavy with sleep. Here in London, dinner was often interrupted by urgent phone calls. Bedtime stories were rushed between official engagements, and family time felt like something that had to be scheduled rather than something that happened naturally. "We have to find a way to protect some of that," Catherine said, but even as she spoke the words, she wasn't sure how they could manage it. The demands of their roles seemed to expand to fill every available hour, leaving little room for the spontaneous family moments that had felt so precious in Scotland. The intercom on Catherine's desk buzzed, and her private secretary's voice informed her that the car would be ready in 15 minutes for her visit to the children's hospital. Catherine glanced at her watch and realized she had lost track of time while reviewing the briefing papers. She would need to change clothes, review her talking points, and mentally prepare herself to meet families who were dealing with their own profound challenges and losses. "I should get ready," she said, gathering her papers. "Will I see you tonight?" William consulted his own schedule. "If the Commonwealth meeting doesn't run late. Otherwise, it might be tomorrow morning." They shared a look of mutual frustration. This was exactly what they had worried about, returning to a life where their relationship became a series of brief encounters between official obligations, where their family time was measured in stolen moments rather than shared experiences. The visit to the children's hospital was both heartbreaking and inspiring, as these events always were. Catherine met with families who were dealing with circumstances far more difficult than her own, parents who were watching their children fight battles that no child should have to face. Their courage and resilience put her own challenges into perspective, but it also reminded her of how much pain and suffering existed in the world beyond the protected bubble of royal life. She spent time in the playroom with children who were between treatments, reading stories, and helping with art projects that transformed the sterile hospital environment into something more hopeful and colorful. One little girl, maybe 6 years old with a bright headscarf covering her bald head, presented Catherine with a drawing of a princess in a very tall castle. "Is she trapped in the tower?" Catherine asked, studying the picture carefully. "No," the girl replied seriously. "She's up there because she can see everything from that high up. She can see where the people need help, and then she can go help them." Catherine was struck by the child's perspective. From the innocence of a 6-year-old's worldview, being in a high position wasn't about privilege or power, but about having a better view of where help was needed. It was a reminder of why she had chosen to embrace this life, despite all its challenges and complications. During the car ride back to Kensington Palace, Catherine found herself thinking about the promise she and William had made to each other at Balmoral. They had sworn to protect their authentic selves and their family time, but less than a week later, they were already struggling to keep that commitment. The pressures of their roles seemed designed to pull them away from the very things that made life meaningful. When she arrived home, she discovered that William was indeed going to be late. The Commonwealth meeting was running into the evening, and he wouldn't be back until after the children's bedtime. Catherine helped with homework, supervised dinner, and managed the complex logistics of getting 3 tired children ready for bed while trying to be fully present for each of them. Lewis wanted to show her a drawing he had made at school, a family portrait that featured everyone holding hands in front of a very large house that looked remarkably like Balmoral. Charlotte needed help with a history project about famous queens, and George wanted to practice piano, but was frustrated because he couldn't master a particularly difficult passage. As she moved between helping with the history research, listening to piano practice, and admiring Lewis's artwork, Catherine realized that this was exactly the kind of multitasking that had always defined motherhood, royal or otherwise. The difference was that most mothers didn't have to squeeze these precious moments between state dinners and diplomatic meetings. By the time all 3 children were settled in bed, Catherine felt emotionally and physically exhausted. She made herself a cup of tea and settled into the sitting room to review her schedule for the following day, but found herself staring out the window instead of reading the briefing papers. William finally arrived home just after 9 o'clock, looking as drained as she felt. He loosened his tie and collapsed into the chair across from her, running his hands through his hair in a gesture she recognized as his way of trying to release the tension of the day. "How was the hospital visit?" he asked, and she could tell he was making an effort to focus on her day despite his own exhaustion. "Heartbreaking and beautiful, like always," Catherine replied. "How was the Commonwealth meeting?" "Long, very long. There were 3 different disagreements about trade policies, and everyone seemed to expect me to have opinions about economic theories that I honestly don't fully understand." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of them too tired for substantial conversation, but grateful to simply be in the same room together. Catherine thought about how this scene would look to an outside observer. 2 people in elegant clothes, sitting in a beautifully appointed room in a palace, surrounded by all the trappings of privilege and luxury. But the reality was that they were simply a married couple, exhausted from their respective workdays, trying to find a few minutes of connection before falling asleep and starting the cycle all over again. "I keep thinking about what that little girl said to me today," Catherine said eventually, and she told William about the drawing of the princess in the tall tower. "She's not wrong," William said thoughtfully. "Being in this position does give us a unique perspective on where help is needed. But sometimes I feel like we're so busy maintaining the tower that we don't have time to actually help anyone." Catherine understood exactly what he meant. Their schedules were packed with events and appearances that were supposed to raise awareness and funds for important causes, but sometimes it felt like the process of preparing for and attending these events consumed more energy than the actual impact they were able to achieve. "What if we tried something different?" Catherine said suddenly, an idea beginning to form her mind. "What if we found ways to do more substantial work with fewer formal events?" William looked at her with interest. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if instead of attending 6 different charity galas in a month, we focused deeply on 2 causes that we really care about? What if we spent more time actually working with the organizations rather than just showing up to be photographed at their fundraisers?" It was a radical idea in the context of royal tradition. The royal family's role had always been defined by visibility and symbolic presence, being seen at events, lending their prestige to worthy causes, serving as figureheads rather than hands-on participants. But Catherine was beginning to question whether that model was still the most effective way to create meaningful change. The palace would never agree to that, William said, but she could see that he was intrigued by the possibility. There are expectations, protocols, traditions that go back generations. But what if those traditions aren't serving anyone well anymore? Catherine pressed. What if we could accomplish more by doing fewer things, but doing them more deeply and authentically? They talked late into the night, imagining what their lives might look like if they approached their roles differently. Instead of being pulled in dozens of different directions, what if they chose specific areas where they could make a real difference? What if they spent less time at ceremonial events and more time actually working on solutions to the problems they cared about? It was a conversation that continued over several days, sometimes in stolen moments between official engagements, sometimes in text messages sent during brief breaks in their schedules. Gradually, they began to develop a clearer vision of how they might restructure their approach to their royal duties. The breakthrough came during an unexpected moment. Catherine was visiting a homeless shelter in East London, an engagement that had been scheduled for only 1 hour, but had stretched longer because she had become deeply involved in conversations with both the staff and the residents. She found herself staying for lunch, helping in the kitchen, and listening to stories that weren't part of any official briefing. One woman, probably in her 50s but looking older due to the hardships she had endured, told Catherine about losing her job during the pandemic and subsequently losing her home. She had been living on the streets for 8 months before finding space in a shelter, and she was now working with a counselor to try to rebuild her life. "The hardest part wasn't being hungry or cold," the woman said. "It was feeling invisible. People would walk past me like I wasn't even there. It makes you start to believe that maybe you don't matter, that maybe nobody would care if you just disappeared." Catherine was deeply moved by this conversation, but what struck her most was how much more meaningful it felt than many of the formal events she attended. Here was a real person dealing with real problems, and their conversation felt honest and important in a way that ribbon-cutting ceremonies and charity galas rarely did. When she finally left the shelter several hours later than planned, Catherine felt energized rather than drained. Her private secretary was somewhat frantic about the schedule disruption, but Catherine realized she didn't care. This was exactly the kind of authentic engagement that she and William had been talking about, work that felt meaningful rather than merely ceremonial. That evening, she shared the experience with William, describing not just what she had learned about homelessness and social services, but how different it had felt to engage with an issue directly rather than simply lending her presence to someone else's event. "I want to go back," she said, "not for another official visit, but to actually volunteer, to learn more about the programs they're running, and see if there are ways we can help develop better solutions." William was quiet for a moment, considering the implications of what she was suggesting. That would be seen as highly unusual," he said. "Royals don't typically volunteer anonymously or work directly with service organizations in that way." "Then maybe it's time to change what's typical," Catherine replied. "Maybe unusual is exactly what we need." As they prepared for bed that night, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of excitement about her work, a feeling that she might be able to make a real difference rather than simply fulfilling ceremonial obligations. The grief over the Queen's death was still there, and the pressures of their roles hadn't disappeared, but she was beginning to see a path forward that felt authentic and purposeful. The silence between them as they settled into sleep wasn't the heavy silence of exhaustion or disconnection, but the peaceful quiet of shared understanding. They were beginning to find their way toward a version of royal service that honored both their duties and their values, an approach that might allow them to be effective in their roles without losing themselves in the process. 6 months had passed since their transformative week at Balmoral, and the changes in William and Catherine's approach to their royal duties were becoming increasingly evident to those who worked closely with them. What had started as whispered conversations about wanting more authentic engagement had evolved into a carefully planned restructuring of their entire approach to public service. Catherine stood in the community garden behind the homeless shelter in East London, her hands dirty from planting vegetables and her hair tied back in a simple ponytail. She had been coming here every Wednesday for the past 3 months, not as the Princess of Wales making an official visit, but as a volunteer learning about urban agriculture and its role in helping people rebuild their lives. The media had initially been confused by her regular, unannounced appearances at the shelter. There were no photo opportunities, no formal speeches, no carefully orchestrated events designed to generate positive publicity. Instead, Catherine simply showed up, worked alongside the staff and residents, and gradually became a familiar presence in the community. Maria, the woman Catherine had first met during her extended visit months earlier, was now helping to manage the garden project. She had found stable housing and part-time employment, but she continued to volunteer at the shelter because, as she explained to Catherine, sometimes you need to give back to the place that saved your life. "The tomatoes are coming along beautifully," Maria said, examining the plants they had started from seeds back in early spring. "Who would have thought a princess would have such a talent for growing vegetables?" Catherine smiled, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her gloved hand. "My husband would say I have a talent for getting thoroughly dirty, which isn't necessarily the same thing." Working in the garden had become a form of meditation for Catherine, a place where she could think clearly while doing something productive with her hands. The repetitive tasks of weeding, watering, and harvesting created space in her mind for processing the larger questions that continued to challenge her. The official events were still there, of course. State dinners couldn't be canceled. Foreign visits required diplomatic participation, and ceremonial duties remained an important part of their roles. But Catherine and William had succeeded in creating more space for the kind of work that felt meaningful to them, even when it meant disappointing some traditional expectations about how royals should spend their time. William had found his own version of this deeper engagement through his work with mental health services for veterans. Instead of simply making speeches about the importance of supporting former military personnel, he had begun spending time at rehabilitation centers, learning about the challenges veterans faced and working with experts to develop more effective support programs. The shift hadn't been without controversy. Some members of the royal household worried that this more hands-on approach was inappropriate, that royals should maintain a certain distance and dignity rather than getting directly involved in social problems. There had been criticism in some media outlets about them abandoning their ceremonial roles in favor of playing social worker. But Catherine had been surprised by how much support they had received from unexpected quarters. Letters arrived daily from people who were inspired by their willingness to engage authentically with difficult issues. Other members of the royal family, including some senior cousins who were typically quite traditional, had expressed quiet approval for their approach. Even King Charles, though initially concerned about the departure from established protocols, had come to appreciate the positive response their work was generating. He had lived through enough public relations challenges to recognize genuine goodwill when he saw it, and the public's response to William and Catherine's more engaged approach had been overwhelmingly positive. On this particular Wednesday, Catherine was working with a group of teenagers who were participating in a job training program that combined gardening skills with life coaching and education support. One 17-year-old, named Jamie, had been skeptical when he first learned that a member of the royal family would be working alongside them in the garden. "I thought it would be some kind of publicity stunt," he admitted to Catherine as they worked together to build raised beds for next season's planting. "Rich people pretending to care for the cameras, you know?" "I understand that skepticism," Catherine replied, holding a board steady while Jamie secured it with screws. "I would probably feel the same way in your position. But you keep showing up," Jamie continued. "Even when it's raining, even when the work is boring. My mom says that's how you know when someone really cares. They stick around for the unglamorous stuff." This conversation stayed with Catherine as she made her way home that evening. Jamie's mother had identified something essential about authentic commitment. It wasn't measured in grand gestures or public declarations, but in the willingness to show up consistently for work that might not be noticed or celebrated. William was already home when she arrived, playing football in the back garden with George and Louis while Charlotte practiced violin inside. The sound of children's laughter mixed with the somewhat discordant notes of a beginner musician created a symphony of domestic chaos that felt infinitely more precious to Catherine than any formal concert she had ever attended. "How was the garden today?" William asked, pausing the game to greet her with a kiss that tasted like grass and sunshine. "Productive," Catherine replied. "We finished the new beds, and Maria thinks we'll have enough vegetables to supply the shelter's kitchen through the autumn." "And how was your session with the veterans group?" she asked in return, noting the particular kind of fatigue that indicated William had been engaged in emotionally demanding work. "Heavy," William admitted. "We talked about nightmares, about feeling disconnected from civilian life, about the guilt that comes with surviving when others didn't. But there were also some breakthroughs, some moments when guys realized they weren't alone with their struggles." These debriefing conversations had become an important part of their daily routine. They had learned that engaging deeply with social problems required emotional processing, that they couldn't simply compartmentalize the stories they heard and the pain they witnessed. They needed to talk through their experiences, support each other, and find ways to carry the weight of others' suffering without being crushed by it. The children had adapted to their parents' new approach with a resilience that seemed to be natural to young people. George, now 10 and increasingly aware of his future role, had started asking thoughtful questions about poverty, mental health, and social justice. Charlotte had announced that she wanted to learn how to grow vegetables so she could help with the garden project. Louis, still young enough to see everything as an adventure, simply enjoyed the stories his parents brought home from their work. "Can we visit the garden sometime?" Charlotte asked over dinner. "I want to see the tomatoes you've been growing." "I think that could be arranged," Catherine replied. "But it would be a working visit. You'd have to help with the weeding and watering." "I don't mind getting dirty," Charlotte declared with the confidence of a 7-year-old who had never encountered a garden task that couldn't be conquered with enthusiasm. As the evening progressed, and they moved through the familiar routines of homework help, bath time, and bedtime stories, Catherine found herself thinking about how much their family life had improved since they had made the conscious decision to approach their roles differently. The guilt that had once plagued her about not being present enough for the children had largely disappeared, replaced by the satisfaction that came from work that felt meaningful and sustainable. It wasn't that their schedules had become less busy. If anything, they were working more hours than before. But the work felt more integrated with their values and priorities, less like a series of disconnected obligations, and more like a coherent effort to make a difference in areas they cared about. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Catherine and William settled into the sitting room with cups of tea and the newspapers that they rarely had time to read during the day. It was a small ritual that they had started during their time at Balmoral and had managed to preserve even with their return to London's pressures. "Look at this," William said, showing Catherine an editorial in one of the major papers. "It's about our approach to royal duties. The headline is The New Royals, Service over Ceremony." Catherine read the article with interest. The writer, a longtime royal correspondent, argued that William and Catherine were pioneering a new model of royal engagement that was more suited to contemporary challenges and expectations. Instead of simply being figureheads, they were becoming advocates and activists, using their positions to draw attention to problems and then working to develop solutions. "She makes some good points," Catherine said, though she was always wary of too much praise in the media. Experience had taught her that public opinion could shift quickly, and what was celebrated today might be criticized tomorrow. "The part about us being more accessible and relatable," William read aloud. "She says we're humanizing the monarchy in ways that make it more relevant to ordinary people's lives." "Do you think that's what we're doing?" Catherine asked. "Humanizing the monarchy?" William considered this question seriously. It touched on something they had both been grappling with, the balance between respecting the traditions and dignity of the royal family while also being authentic and engaged in ways that felt natural to them. "I think we're trying to find a way to be royal and human at the same time," he said eventually. "Previous generations maybe felt like they had to choose one or the other, but I think it's possible to maintain the respect and dignity of the institution while still being real people dealing with real problems." "Your grandmother managed it," Catherine observed. "She was always completely dignified and formal in public, but she also had this way of connecting with people that felt genuine. Remember how she was with the children? Even in the most formal settings, she could make them feel seen and valued. She understood that the crown was something she wore, not something she was," William agreed. "I think that's what we're trying to learn, how to carry the weight of the role without losing ourselves under it." As they prepared for bed, Catherine reflected on how much had changed in the year since the Queen's death. The grief was still there, but it had transformed from an overwhelming sense of loss into something more like inspiration. Elizabeth II's example had shown them that it was possible to serve with dedication and dignity while still maintaining personal authenticity and family connections. The next morning brought news that would test their commitment to their new approach. Catherine's private secretary informed her that there had been a request from the palace to attend a high-profile charity gala in Monaco, an event that would involve several days of travel, extensive wardrobe requirements, and the kind of formal socializing with international dignitaries that they had been trying to minimize. "It's exactly the sort of event that would have been automatic before," Catherine explained to William as they discussed the request over breakfast. "High visibility, good media coverage, important social connections. A year ago, we wouldn't have questioned whether to accept. But now," William prompted, "now I find myself asking what we would actually accomplish by going beyond being photographed in beautiful clothes at a glamorous event," Catherine said. "Would our presence actually help the charity raise more money? Would we learn anything that would help us with our own work? Or would it just be 3 days away from our children and our projects for the sake of maintaining social obligations?" This was the kind of decision that had become increasingly common as they tried to live up to their commitment to prioritize authentic engagement over ceremonial appearances. Every invitation required careful consideration of whether it aligned with their values and goals or whether it was simply an obligation that they were expected to fulfill because of their positions. The garden project is at a critical stage, Catherine continued. If I'm away for 3 days next week, I'll miss the workshop on financial literacy that we've been planning for months. The teenagers are counting on me to be there. And I have the follow-up session with the veterans group, William added. It's the first time we're bringing in family members, and some of these guys have never talked to their wives about their war experiences. I can't just reschedule that for the sake of a party in Monaco. The decision, when they finally made it, felt both liberating and slightly terrifying. They would decline the Monaco invitation, despite the disappointment it would cause in certain diplomatic and social circles. Instead, they would focus on the work that felt meaningful to them, the commitments they had made to communities that were counting on their continued involvement. Are we being irresponsible? Catherine asked as they prepared to face the inevitable criticism that would follow their decision. I don't think so, William replied. I think we're being intentional about how we use our time and influence. The world doesn't need more pictures of us at glamorous parties, but it might benefit from the work we're doing with homelessness and veteran services. That afternoon, Catherine returned to the community garden with a sense of renewed purpose. She had chosen this work over the glittering social obligations that had once seemed so important, and the choice felt right in a way that surprised her with its clarity. As she worked alongside Maria and Jamie and the other volunteers, Catherine thought about the Queen's legacy and what it meant to serve with dignity and purpose. Elizabeth II had found her way to balance duty and authenticity within the constraints of her time and circumstances. Now, Catherine and William were finding their own way to honor that legacy while adapting it to the challenges and opportunities of their own era. The silence that had once felt heavy with uncertainty and grief had transformed into something more peaceful and purposeful. It was the quiet that came from knowing that their work mattered, that their choices aligned with their values, and that they were building something meaningful for their children and for the communities they served. When Catherine arrived home that evening, dirt still under her fingernails and satisfaction in her heart, she found William reading bedtime stories to the children. The scene was so ordinary and so precious that it took her breath away. Her husband's voice creating magical worlds for their children, the soft lamplight creating intimate shadows in the nursery, the peaceful ending to another day spent in service to others. This, she realized, was what the Queen had meant about living fully in the present. Not every moment had to be historically significant or worthy of commemoration. Sometimes the most meaningful legacy was created in the accumulation of ordinary days spent doing work that mattered, raising children with love and attention, and finding ways to serve others without losing sight of what made life precious and worth living.